My childhood was anything but ordinary. My younger brother Tim and I grew up in an isolated cabin in the middle of a dense forest. Life there was lonely and difficult, not just because of the isolation, but mainly because of our mother. She was a cruel, distant woman who seemed to harbor a silent hatred toward us. We were 2 of her 8 children, but somehow, we were the ones who suffered the most from her indifference. While our other siblings were ignored, we were mistreated. We'd be locked in the garage next to the house for days without food, with a bucket as our only bathroom. I was the oldest, and I felt I had to take care of Tim, who was only 6 at the time. He was small, fragile, and always scared. I tried to keep hope alive for the both of us, telling stories or doing whatever I could to distract Tim from our circumstances. But there was one fear I couldn't shake. Tim had started talking about something strange. "The monster," he would whisper, his eyes wide with fear. At first, I thought he was just imagining things, creating fantasies to cope with the fear and suffering. But at night, he would become restless, holding my hand so tightly his fingers hurt. "It comes to see us at night," Tim would say, staring into the darkness outside the small garage window. Back then, I thought it was just a recurring nightmare. But after a while, I began to notice disturbing details. On the nights when he woke up terrified, I would hear sounds outside the garage, branches snapping, the wind carrying a strange noise I couldn't identify. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, especially since hunger and exhaustion weighed heavier on our bodies each day. Then, on an especially dark and silent night, what seemed like nothing more than a child's fear became something far more real. Tim was awake, trembling under the old blanket we shared. He was convinced the monster was closer than ever. I tried to calm him, telling him nothing was going to happen, that there was nothing out there. But then we heard it, a loud thud. Something was pounding on the garage door. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe an animal. But the sound was loud, violent, as if something was desperately trying to get in. Tim clung to me, quietly sobbing, while my heart raced. The pounding grew stronger, so intense that the old wooden door seemed to vibrate. I knew there was nothing we could do but stay still and pray that whatever it might be, wouldn't get inside. The hours seemed to drag on, and with each pound, the terror inside me grew. I was the oldest, the one responsible, but that night I felt as helpless as Tim. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the sounds before. We stayed awake, motionless, until dawn. When the sun finally rose, we left the garage, exhausted and shaken, but eager to see what had happened. Maybe it had just been the wind or a lost animal, I thought, trying to cling to some logical explanation. But nothing could have prepared us for what we saw. On the ground, around the door, were footprints. Huge footprints, unlike any animal I knew. They were deep, far too large to belong to any common creature in the forest. The shape was strange, with 3 long, thick claws, almost as if a dinosaur had walked by during the night. I knelt beside the marks, feeling that same cold air of fear settle over me again. They were real, and they confirmed what Tim had been saying for weeks. The monster existed, and it had come to visit us. I looked at Tim, who was standing next to me, his eyes wide and full of fear. He just nodded slowly, as if to say, "I told you." Those marks were never explained. No one would have believed us if we'd told them, and our mother didn't even bother to ask what had happened. To her, we were insignificant, but we knew the truth. After that night, the fear of the monster never fully left us. Even now, so many years later, I still feel the same sense of dread whenever I think about that day. What was it? What did it want with us? Those questions were never answered. One night, my friend Lucas and I were out hunting coyotes, something we did fairly often to help control the population on the land around his farm. It was a clear night, with the full moon lighting up the sky, and the forest around us seemed calm. We were prepared for a long watch, patiently waiting for any sign of movement in the bushes. It was one of those nights where everything felt quieter than usual. The crickets chirped in the distance, and the wind gently swayed the trees. We were well equipped, our flashlights and rifles ready. But so far, the night had been uneventful. Suddenly, something caught our attention. It wasn't the sharp cry of a coyote, but a different noise, almost like a moan, coming from the shadows. We pointed our flashlights in that direction and saw a deer stepping out from between the trees. The animal was unusually close, which was strange because deer typically avoid humans. It seemed disturbed, moving slowly, emitting low, almost moaning sounds. But something was very wrong. As I looked closer, I noticed the deer wasn't behaving naturally. Its movements were disjointed, as if it were spinning in circles, and its head jerked from side to side in an erratic motion. "What the hell is it doing?" Lucas whispered, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. As we continued to watch, the deer's behavior became even more bizarre. It started making strange noises, sounds that shouldn't come from an animal like that. It was almost as if it was trying to mimic something human. Suddenly, the deer stopped moving and stared directly at us, its eyes glowing in the beam of our flashlights. The air around us seemed to grow colder, and the silence was shattered by a sound that still echoes in my mind. It laughed. Yes, the deer let out a sound that resembled laughter. It wasn't a natural noise, but a grotesque imitation of a human laugh. My whole body tensed and fear crept up my spine. This wasn't normal, not even close. It was as if nature had twisted itself into something unrecognizable right before our eyes. Before we had time to react, the deer, with an unnerving agility, leaped over a nearby fence with an unnatural force. We stood frozen, trying to process what we had just witnessed. The forest, which had once seemed serene, now felt sinister and full of secrets. Lucas, who had always been the braver one between us, remained silent for a few seconds before finally murmuring, "Let's get out of here." Without any further questions, we made our way back to the truck, our eyes and ears alert for any more strange sounds. The deer, or whatever it was, had vanished into the night, but the fear and confusion stayed with us. To this day, we still can't explain what happened that night. The forest, the sounds, the deer's behavior, everything felt like some grotesque illusion, as if we had witnessed something we weren't meant to see. Whatever it was, it left its mark on us, and I've never looked at the quiet of a hunting night the same way again. The deer's laugh still echoes in my head, a reminder that there are things in nature that defy all logic. My childhood was filled with adventures in the forest behind our house. My younger brother, Mateus, and I spent hours exploring every corner of that place, climbing trees and making up stories. But the highlight of all our games was the treehouse our father had built for us. It was our refuge, our secret castle. Up there, high among the branches, we felt invincible. That summer day, like so many others, we climbed into the treehouse right after lunch. The sky was clear, the air filled with the smell of leaves and the sounds of birds. Everything seemed normal until something strange happened. The air grew heavy, as if the entire forest had suddenly held its breath. Mateus was playing with one of our action figures, while I stared absent-mindedly at the trees around us. That's when I saw it. In the branches above the treehouse, there was something. At first, I thought it was just a large bird or some wild animal, but when I looked again, I realized it was much more than that. The creature was huge, with sharp claws and red eyes that glowed in the shadows of the leaves. The sunlight didn't seem to hit it normally. Instead, it moved stealthily, almost like a living shadow, its eyes fixed on us. My body froze for a moment, unable to believe what I was seeing. I tried to warn Mateus, but before I could say anything, the creature attacked. It was fast, faster than anything I had ever seen. It lunged with an agile motion, knocking Mateus out of the treehouse with a swipe of its sharp claws. Mateus's scream still echoes in my head to this day. He fell to the ground with a dull thud, and my heart raced. Without thinking, I scrambled down the rope ladder as fast as I could, every second counting as the creature remained in the branches, watching us. Mateus was lying on the ground, gasping, struggling to breathe. He had fallen badly and was clearly hurt, clutching his abdomen in pain. I tried to keep him calm, telling him everything would be fine, while I fought to carry him back home. I glanced up one last time before we left, and the creature was still there, its red eyes glowing through the leaves. We made it back to the house, and my father saw us come in, terrified and drenched in sweat. As soon as I explained what had happened, he rushed Mateus to the car, and we went straight to the hospital. There, they found out that Mateus had suffered internal injuries from the fall, and he had to stay in the hospital for a few days. Despite the severity of the situation, he recovered, but what happened in that treehouse left a mark on us both. In the days that followed, I told my father the story about the creature, its red eyes, and how it attacked Mateus. At first, he thought it was just our imagination, something we had made up to cope with the trauma. But then, a few days later, as we were coming back from the hospital with Mateus fully recovered, we all heard it. A scream. It was the same sound I had heard in the treehouse, a sharp, supernatural scream coming from the forest. My father froze, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He didn't say a word, but the next day, without warning, he went to the treehouse with an axe and tore it down completely. "You're not going back into that forest," he said, his voice firm, like an unbreakable order. From that day on, he never let us near the forest again, and we never asked to go. Something about that night, about that scream, made everyone believe what I had seen. It wasn't just a children's story or a trick of the mind caused by fear. There was something in that forest, something dangerous that had been watching us, and I knew that if the creature hadn't attacked, we might have stayed there longer, unaware of the real threat. What was it? I don't know. No one ever found out. But after my father destroyed the treehouse, the sound disappeared. Still, the memory of what I saw and the terror of that moment live on inside me. And to this day, whenever I see the forest from a distance, I feel that same chill, as if the creature's red eyes are still there, hidden, waiting. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. It was one of those nights that seemed normal at first glance, but looking back, I could tell something in the air felt different. My friend Marcos and I were camping in a remote area, a dense forest we knew well from our many adventures. We'd spent the day exploring, hunting, and laughing, but when night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The silence in the forest felt heavier, as if something was lurking. We were sitting around the campfire, talking about our past adventures, when, out of nowhere, a strange sound echoed through the forest. It was a high-pitched scream, unlike anything we had ever heard. It didn't sound like any animal native to the region, and it certainly wasn't the wind. It was something more visceral, something that sent chills down our spines. Marcos and I exchanged glances, and without needing to say a word, we knew we had to investigate. We grabbed our flashlights and began following the sound, cautiously walking along the trail. As we got closer, the silence grew more oppressive. There were no more insect noises or rustling from small animals, just the sound of our footsteps on the dry leaves. With each step, the weight of an unseen presence seemed to grow heavier. The scream had stopped, but something still lingered in the air, something we couldn't see but could feel. Then we heard the footsteps, heavy footsteps coming from the darkness. They were different from ours, firmer, more deliberate. They weren't far off, but we couldn't pinpoint their source. We stopped walking, and I felt my breath grow short. There was something or someone approaching us, but it wasn't normal. Every step seemed to carry a threat, as if we had intruded into a place that wasn't ours. We stood there, flashlights trembling in our hands, trying to see what was around us. The weak light only revealed long shadows cast by the trees, and the sound of the footsteps kept getting closer. My body was frozen with fear. Marcos was just as terrified as I was. There wasn't much we could do except wait. Suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence returned, but this time it was suffocating, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We stayed there for what felt like an eternity, not daring to move. The fear kept us frozen in place, waiting for any sign of whatever it was. Finally, Gathering our courage, we decided to head back to camp, walking backward and keeping our flashlights pointed into the darkness. But the feeling of being watched never left us. We could sense the presence following us, not making a sound, just waiting. When we got back to camp, we tried to calm ourselves down and get some sleep, but the fear wouldn't let us rest. Throughout the night, we woke up several times, hearing branches snapping in the trees and the distant sound of those same footsteps. But the presence never revealed itself. It stayed there, lurking, keeping its distance. The next day, we decided to return to the area where we had heard the screams. The place felt different. What we found left us even more disturbed. On several trees around us, branches were broken, not naturally, as if they had fallen from the wind, but arranged in an almost ritualistic pattern. They formed a circle high above our heads, as if someone or something had deliberately placed them there. The branches were twisted in strange ways, as if some force had been applied to them, something that didn't seem to be the work of any animal in the region. We looked up, trying to make sense of what could have done that, but no explanation made sense. The circle of broken branches was a mark telling us we were in a place that didn't belong to us. At that moment, we knew we had to leave. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be found, and we had intruded on its space. We hurried back to camp, packed up our things, and left the forest without looking back. To this day, Marcos and I avoid talking about that night. There are things we'll never be able to explain, but we both know it wasn't our imagination. The forest, usually so peaceful and welcoming, hides secrets we were never meant to uncover. The circle of branches still haunts me, a silent warning that there are forces in nature we don't understand, and it's best to leave them undisturbed. Lucas and I had always been naturally curious. That weekend, we decided to explore a part of the forest neither of us knew well. It was a dense, remote place, perfect for spending an afternoon discovering hidden trails and enjoying nature. We'd done this many times before, and it had never been more than a fun adventure. But that afternoon, something different happened, something that completely changed the way I see the forest. As we walked along the trail, we came across two young guys, probably our age, emerging from a denser area of the woods. They seemed friendly, and after a quick hey, we started chatting casually. They told us they were heading to an abandoned shed just a bit further ahead and invited us to come along. At first, the idea excited us. Lucas and I loved exploring abandoned places, and the chance to see a hidden spot deep in the forest sounded like the perfect opportunity. The two guys seemed laid back, like they had been there many times before. Still, something bothered me. I couldn't explain why, but a strange feeling began growing in the pit of my stomach as we walked deeper into the woods. After a while, Lucas, who was walking slightly ahead of me, suddenly stopped. He was staring at something among the trees, his expression tense. When I followed his gaze, I saw a man hiding behind a rock, crouched low, spying on us. He was far off, but it was clear he was watching us. The unease I'd been feeling intensified. That man didn't seem to be with the two guys who were leading us, and his sneaky presence only worsened the sense that something was off. When Lucas looked at me, I could see he was thinking the same thing. We needed to get out of there. Using the excuse that we had to head back soon, we started to pull away, trying not to show the panic that was already gripping us. But the two guys insisted we come to the shed, saying we were almost there. Growing more suspicious, we refused again and quickened our pace in the opposite direction. That's when we heard a scream. An older man, stepping out from behind some nearby trees, started yelling aggressively. We couldn't make out exactly what he was saying, but his voice was loud and furious. He seemed enraged that we were there. That was all we needed. Without hesitation, Lucas and I began running, our hearts racing. The sound of branches snapping and leaves crunching underfoot echoed as we fled as fast as we could through the forest. We didn't dare look back. We just ran, fear chasing us the entire way. We didn't stop until we reached the main road. Out of breath, we were relieved to finally be far from that place. We immediately decided to call the police and report what had happened. We told them about the man spying on us, the two guys, and the older man yelling. Something about that shed seemed deeply suspicious, and we couldn't just ignore it. The police listened carefully and promised to investigate. The next day, we got a call. What the officers found at the site only confirmed our worst fears. When they searched the shed, they found a hammer and several syringes scattered around. The items had been hidden, but there was no denying that something sinister could have happened there, or was about to happen. The young men who had invited us and the older man had disappeared, leaving behind only those disturbing objects. To this day, we still don't know what was really going on at that shed, or what might have happened if we had stayed. But one thing is certain. That forest, which once felt like a place of adventure, now carries a different weight. The thought that we could have been victims of something terrible haunts me to this day. It was a job like any other, or at least it should have been. I had been a lumberjack for years, accustomed to the isolation of forests and the constant sound of trees falling to the axe. That summer, I was hired to work in a remote area that was being cleared for a housing development. The forest there was dense, ancient, with a strange, heavy silence. But, as always, I was there to do my job without thinking too much about my surroundings. The first few days were uneventful, though an increasing sense of discomfort lingered. Something about that forest seemed off. The silence was too thick, as if something were watching. My colleagues noticed it too, but no one talked much about it. We figured it was just the isolation and exhaustion getting the better of us. That particular day, I took a break after a few hours of chopping trees. I sat on a fallen log, drinking some water and enjoying the brief moment of rest. That's when I heard it for the first time. A faint noise like the snapping of branches, but there was something different about it. The sound was slow, deliberate, like something was moving cautiously. I stayed silent, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't uncommon to encounter animals in the forest, but that sound didn't match anything I had heard before. I looked around, and that's when I saw it. Between the trees, the figure of something. Not human. It was large, crouched between the trunks. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and hairless. The skin seemed to radiate a strange heat, as if it were burning from the inside. But what scared me the most were the eyes. Two glowing red dots that seemed to pierce through me, as if it knew I was there. I froze for a moment, unable to move or look away. My first instinct was to think my mind was playing tricks on me, but as the creature moved, slowly rising, I realized it was very real. Panic gripped me. Without a second thought, I got up and started running toward the truck where my colleagues were resting. The sound of branches breaking behind me made it clear the creature was following. I didn't need to look back to know. The heat intensified as it drew closer, and all I could do was run as fast as my legs would carry me. When I reached the truck, breathless, I shouted for my colleagues to get in. They saw the fear in my eyes and didn't ask questions. As the engine roared to life and the truck sped off, I caught a glimpse of the creature standing at the edge of the forest, its red eyes glowing from the shadows. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the sounds of the chase. On the drive back, no one spoke much. I tried to explain what I had seen, but it was hard to put into words. My colleagues were just as scared as I was, but no one wanted to admit it. It was easier to pretend it hadn't happened, that we were just tired, and that the summer heat was making us imagine things. But the next day, something pulled us back to the site. Maybe it was curiosity, or the need to confirm that what I'd seen wasn't real. Armed with rifles, a standard safety measure in forested areas, we returned to the same spot where I had seen the creature. When we arrived, the silence was even heavier, as if the forest was holding its breath. But it didn't take long for the creature to reappear. It emerged from the shadows, taller and more menacing than I remembered. Its red eyes locked onto us, and an almost suffocating heat radiated from its body, as if the air around it was distorted. One of my colleagues, acting on pure reflex, raised his rifle and fired. The sound of the shots echoed through the forest, and for a moment, I thought the creature wouldn't move. But then, it let out a piercing scream, a sound that seemed to come from another world, and disappeared into the forest, vanishing among the trees with impossible speed. We stood there for a long time, the silence taking over again. We didn't know what it was, but one thing was certain. It was not something we wanted to encounter again. In the days that followed, the incident never left my mind. Every time I thought about the creature, its tracks in the dirt, and the feeling of being chased, a chill ran down my spine. Although we returned to that area a few more times to finish the job, we never saw it again. But the fear and the uncertainty stayed with me, like an invisible scar. What was it? And why was it there? I never found answers to those questions, but I know that something in that forest was not natural. Whatever it was, it left deep marks, not just on the forest floor, but on me as well. It was a cold winter morning when my father and I set out to hunt. I grew up venturing deep into the forests of our region with him, learning to hunt and respect nature. That place had always felt peaceful and familiar, but on that morning, the forest seemed different. The air was heavier, and the silence, which was usually comforting, now felt oppressive. As we walked slowly, alert to nature's signs, we heard something that made us stop. A sharp, distant scream, echoing from somewhere among the trees. It wasn't a usual forest sound, not the howl of a coyote, the growl of a bear, or the noise of any other animal we knew. It was something much stranger, something that sent an instant chill down my spine. What was that? I asked, trying to hide my nervousness. My father frowned, his gaze fixed in the direction the sound had come from. He didn't answer right away, which made me even more uncomfortable. My father, who was always calm and unshakable, seemed as uncertain as I was. For a moment, we stood still, listening to the forest around us, waiting for another sign. The silence returned, but the feeling of being watched lingered. We continued walking, trying to focus on the hunt. But soon, we heard that sound again, a scream, followed by a heavy noise, like branches being forcefully broken. This time it was closer. I glanced at my father and saw the worry etched on his face. Suddenly, he stopped, his eyes fixed on something between the trees ahead. I followed his gaze, and then I saw it. A large, fur-covered figure, standing tall, hidden among the shadows of the trees. It was hard to see clearly, but I could make out the outline of its body and the thick texture of its fur. It looked almost human, but at the same time, something far more primal and powerful. Before I could ask what we were seeing, the creature disappeared into the forest, moving quickly and gracefully. The sound of breaking branches and crushed leaves vanished as swiftly as it had come. We stood there, frozen, trying to process what we had just witnessed. "Let's go back," my father said, his voice firm but low. I obeyed without question, and together, we started the long walk back home. The silence between us was heavy, and no words seemed necessary. I knew what we had seen wasn't something ordinary, and my father, who had spent his entire life in these forests, seemed just as shaken as I was. When we arrived at the village, my father decided to consult the local elders. They were wise men and women who knew the old stories and the secrets of the forest. If anyone knew what we had seen, it would be them. We sat around a fire, and my father described what we had encountered. The elders listened in silence, showing no sign of surprise. When he finished, one of the elders, an old man with a long, graying beard, looked at us with a steady gaze. "What you saw are the guardians of the forest," he said, his voice deep and respectful. "They've been here long before us, protectors of the ancient lands. Few ever get the chance to see them, and those who do know it's a sign to respect the forest and what it holds." The silence around the fire grew even heavier. My father remained quiet, absorbing the words. I, on the other hand, felt a mix of curiosity and unease. Guardians? Protectors? I had never heard of this legend before. "They do no harm to those who respect their territory," the elder continued. "But to those who lack reverence for the forest, they may show themselves in a different way." The elder's words echoed in my mind as we made our way home that night. Whatever we had seen wasn't something to be fully understood. It wasn't just an ordinary animal, nor a vague legend. It was something real, something that reminded us that the forest, no matter how familiar it seemed, still held ancient secrets, beings that had existed long before us. After that day, We never returned to that part of the forest. We respected what we had seen and left the forest in peace. The guardians, as the elders called them, remained a mystery, a reminder that there are forces in nature we shouldn't question, only respect. And every now and then, when I'm alone in the forest, I hear the distant echo of those strange sounds and remember that, even unseen, the guardians are there, watching. For years, my friends and I loved exploring the forest near our town. It was a peaceful escape, far from the rush of everyday life. On that autumn afternoon, we decided to venture deeper than usual, down a trail none of us were familiar with. The sun was already starting to dip behind the trees, and the air had that fresh smell of fallen leaves and damp earth. We were relaxed, chatting and laughing, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. The trail was more closed in, the trees taller. Sunlight filtered weakly through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. We were distracted, trying to find some interesting spot when the sound hit us. A whistle. It stopped our conversation immediately. It was sharp and short, slicing through the silence of the forest like a blade. We exchanged glances, trying to figure out where it had come from. At first, we thought it might have been the wind or some animal, but there was something off about that sound. It didn't seem natural. It sounded human. The whistle came again, this time closer. We all turned in the same direction, and among the shadows of the trees, we saw something. A silhouette, a man standing, watching us. He was distant, almost indistinguishable among the trees, but close enough for us to notice his presence. The stranger remained still, as if assessing us. We couldn't see his face, just the dark outline of his figure among the leaves. "Let's get out of here," one of my friends said, his voice tense. We all agreed immediately. Without a second thought, we started heading back down the trail. The silence now felt suffocating, and even the wind seemed to have stopped. We could feel we were being watched, and the idea of that man silently observing us from afar filled me with unease. As we walked, the whistle echoed again, now further away. I glanced back, but the figure was gone. We continued in silence until we reached a clearing that seemed familiar, a good place to stop and catch our breath before heading back for good. That's when something bizarre caught our attention. In the middle of the clearing, stuck to the ground, was a teddy bear. It looked old, dirty, and worn, but the most disturbing thing was how it was pinned down. Thick branches had been driven into the soil around the bear, forming a cross over it, as if someone had purposely tied it to the earth. "What the hell?" one of my friends muttered, his voice tinged with nervousness. The atmosphere around us shifted immediately. The silence grew even heavier, as if the entire forest was watching. No one said anything, but we all knew something very strange was happening. Who would place a teddy bear like that? And why? Questions started swirling in our minds, but no answer made sense. The whistle echoed again, fainter this time, but still audible. It felt like a warning, as if something or someone was monitoring us, waiting for our next move. We didn't want to stick around to find out what would happen if we stayed any longer. "Let's go now," one of my friends said without hesitation. We left the clearing as quickly as we could, not daring to look back. The walk back was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The feeling of being followed never left us, as if the forest itself was alive around us. When we finally emerged from the forest and reached the parking lot, the relief was immediate, but the fear still lingered. None of us talked about what we saw in that clearing, as if mentioning it would bring something bad back. The teddy bear pinned to the ground, the branches forming a cross, the man watching us. These were things none of us could explain. We drove home in silence, each of us carrying the weight of that strange encounter. After that afternoon, we never returned to that part of the forest. The whistle, the man, and that old teddy bear stayed with us, a constant reminder that there are things in nature we're better off not understanding. My wife, Amanda, and I have always loved skiing. For us, winter meant escapes to the mountains, the cold wind on our faces, and the adrenaline of the slopes. That weekend, We were excited to spend a few days on the ski trails of a resort we hadn't been to before. It was a quiet place, perfect for getting away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. That afternoon, the sun was beginning to set, and we decided to go for one more run before heading back to the cabin. We followed a trail that seemed to be the same one we had taken earlier, but without realizing it, we ended up on a different path. The snow was denser, and the trees around us seemed to grow thicker by the minute. That's when we realized we were far from any signs of other people or marked trails. We tried not to panic, but the reality was clear. We were lost. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the temperature began to drop rapidly. We tried retracing our steps, but the heavy snow had already covered our tracks. The only option was to prepare to spend the night in the forest. We knew that if we kept walking in the dark, we could get even more lost. We did the best we could to stay warm. We used our jackets and the gear we had, but the cold was relentless. During the night, the silence of the forest was unsettling. All we could hear was the distant sound of the wind blowing through the trees and the occasional crack of branches. Amanda was worried, but she stayed calm. The thought of our 1-year-old baby, who was with her grandparents, gave us the strength to face the night. The next morning, tired and freezing, we heard something that gave us hope: the sound of engines in the distance. We quickly got up, and not long after, we saw a group of snowmobilers approaching us. They were volunteers assisting with a search coordinated by the police. Amanda's brother had become worried when we didn't return to the cabin, and he had quickly alerted the authorities. We were rescued and brought back to safety, exhausted but incredibly relieved. That could have been the end of our adventure. But weeks later, another encounter with nature showed us just how exposed we were to the unexpected. We were on a light hike just to enjoy the fresh mountain air, this time bringing our baby along in the stroller. The weather was perfect, and the trail seemed safe and peaceful. But at one point, Amanda suddenly stopped. I saw her staring at something ahead of us, her expression shifting into sheer panic. I followed her gaze and saw what she was looking at: a mountain lion, just a few meters in front of us, standing still in the middle of the trail. It was motionless, watching us, as if calculating its next move. Fear took hold of us immediately. I knew that any sudden movement could trigger the animal to attack. Amanda gripped my hand tightly, and the only thing she could manage to say, almost breathless, was, "Stay calm." Time seemed to stop. The lion stared us down, and every second felt like an eternity. Amanda, in a protective instinct, slowly began to back away, pulling the stroller with our baby out of sight. Her only focus was to get the animal out of our line of sight and get us to safety. As we made our way back, we encountered a few hikers heading in the opposite direction. Amanda, still in a state of shock, couldn't speak. Her only goal was to keep the lion away from us. She knew that if she warned the others, it could draw the animal's attention. She chose to stay silent, hoping the lion would remain focused on us and disappear before the other hikers realized something was wrong. Finally, when we reached the safety of our car, Amanda broke down in tears. She was overwhelmed by what had happened and the thought of how things could have ended. We left the trail without looking back, grateful that nothing had happened to our son. After those 2 incidents, our relationship with nature changed. We still love the mountains, but now we know they hide unexpected dangers, and that no matter how prepared we may be, the unexpected can always happen. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 10 disturbing true summertime horror stories by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.